The night was cold. The kind of cold that bites your skin and makes you pull your jacket tight around your chest. It was past midnight on a Friday, and Pastor Emmanuel's wife, Sister Grace, could not sleep. She had driven out to find her husband's forgotten Bible from the church office, and on her way back, she made a wrong turn. That wrong turn changed everything. She found herself on Shiloh Lane, a street that nobody from their church talked about in the open, but everybody whispered about in secret. The street where women stood under orange lights, where loud music poured out of dark doorways, where shadows moved and deals were made. Sister Grace slowed her car down, shaking her head slowly the way good church women do when they pass a place like that. She was about to turn around, but then she saw something that made her foot slam the brakes so hard the car jerked forward. 3 girls, standing right there on Shiloh Lane, under the orange lights, laughing. And Sister Grace knew those faces. She knew them very, very well.
Sandra,
Mirabel,
Joy,
the 3 most celebrated young women in Victory Gospel Church. The girls who sang in the choir every Sunday. The girls who led the youth prayer group every Wednesday. The girls who wore the cleanest white dresses, carried the thickest Bibles, and bowed the lowest when the pastor prayed. Those girls, standing on that street, at that hour. Sister Grace's mouth opened slowly. Her hand came up to cover it. And in that moment, before she could even think clearly, her phone was already in her hand. She took a photo. One photo that would tear an entire church apart. But before we get to what happened next, before we get to the tears, the accusations, the Sunday morning that nobody in Victory Gospel Church would ever forget, we need to go back. We need to go back to where this story really started. Because the night Sister Grace saw those girls on Shiloh Lane was not the beginning. It was just the moment the fire became visible. The fire had been burning for a long time. 3 months earlier, Victory Gospel Church was the happiest place on Oakery Street. It was the kind of church that smelled like fresh flowers and anointing oil. The kind where the worship was loud enough to shake the windows, and the pastor's voice boomed like a drum when he preached. Children ran around the compound on Sunday mornings while mothers in bright head ties laughed together near the gate. Old men sat under the mango trees sharing peppermint sweets. Ushers in white gloves directed people to their seats with big, proud smiles. And right in the front row of the choir stand, every single Sunday, stood Sandra, Mirabel, and Joy. People called them the 3 Graces, though that was never an official title. It was just something the older women of the church started saying, and it stuck. Sandra was 23. She was tall with quiet eyes and a voice so beautiful that when she led worship, grown men cried without knowing why. She had grown up in the church. Her mother was the head of the women's fellowship, and her father had been a deacon before he passed away 4 years ago. Mirabel was 21. She was small and bright-faced with a laugh like a bell. She was studying nursing at the State Polytechnic and was known for visiting sick members of the congregation at the hospital on her own time, bringing them food and prayers, without anyone asking her to. Joy was the youngest at 19. She had only joined Victory Gospel Church 2 years ago, after moving to the city from a small village in the east. She was quiet most of the time, but when she opened her mouth to sing, every conversation in the room stopped. These 3 had become best friends quickly, the way young women do when they find each other in a place that feels safe. They sat together in church. They studied together. They cooked together on weekends at Sandra's small apartment near the market. They prayed together every night over a WhatsApp voice note they sent to each other before bed. Everyone saw them and said the same thing. These are good girls. These are the girls we want our daughters to become. But what nobody saw, what nobody in that church ever took the time to look for, was what was happening behind each smile. Sandra's mother was sick. Not a little sick. Not the kind of sick that gets better with rest and hot pepper soup. She had been diagnosed with kidney disease 8 months before the story begins, and the hospital had told Sandra, quietly, in a small office that smelled like bleach, that her mother needed dialysis 3 times a week or she would not survive the year. Dialysis costs money. A lot of money. More money than Sandra made from her part-time teaching job at the primary school down the road. Sandra had gone to the church for help. She had sat in front of Pastor Emmanuel himself and explained everything with dry eyes and a steady voice, because she was the kind of person who did not cry easily in front of others. The pastor had nodded. He had said, "We will pray. God is a provider. Trust him." She had waited. She had prayed. But her mother's hospital bills kept growing, and the chair outside the pastor's office stayed empty every time Sandra came back to follow up. Mirabel's story was different. Mirabel was carrying something that nobody in that church knew about. Her father, a man who came to church every Sunday and shook hands with the pastor and said, "God is good," loudly enough for everyone to hear, had been beating her mother for 15 years. Mirabel had grown up watching it. She had learned very early how to be invisible in a house where noise meant danger. She had learned how to press her face into her pillow at night and cry without making a sound. She had learned how to smile in church on Sunday and act like the walls of her home were not covered in the memories of pain. When she turned 18, she had tried to speak to one of the older women in the church, one of the women her mother trusted. She had not said everything. She had just asked, carefully, "What does the Bible say about a husband who hurts his wife?" The woman had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had said, "Marriage is a covenant, my daughter. We don't break what God has joined. We pray, and we endure." Mirabel had nodded. She had walked away, and she had never brought it up in church again. Joy's story was the one that would break your heart the most. Joy had come to this city alone. Her parents were back in the village, and when she said she was going to the city to work and study, her father had said, "Don't bring shame to this family." Those were the last real words he had spoken to her before she left. She had found a room to rent in a house shared by 6 other people. She had found a small job as a data entry clerk at a printing company. The pay was small, embarrassingly small, but it was enough to eat and pay her rent, and she was grateful. Then, 2 months before the story begins, the printing company lost a big contract. They laid off half their staff. Joy was one of them. She spent 3 weeks looking for a new job. She sent messages. She visited offices. She asked everyone she knew. Nothing came. Her rent was due. Her food was running out. She had gone to Sandra and Mirabel and told them quietly, "I'm struggling a little. I don't want to bother anyone, but I didn't know who else to tell." Sandra had looked at Mirabel. Mirabel had looked at Sandra. And something unspoken had passed between them, the kind of look that only passes between people who are both already drowning and have just found someone else in the water. It was Mirabel who first heard about the opportunity. Not from a bad person. Not from someone trying to lead them astray. From a girl named Temi, a quiet, serious girl who worked nights at a hotel near the airport and used her income to pay for her younger brother's secondary school fees. Temi was not a church girl, but she was not a bad person either. She was just a girl doing what she had to do. She had heard about Joy's situation through a mutual friend and had come to find them one evening at Sandra's apartment. She had sat down, accepted the cup of tea Sandra offered, and then said plainly, "I know you girls are in church. I respect that. I'm not here to pull you away from anything, but I know a place where a girl can make real money in one evening. Honest work. Serving drinks and entertaining guests at private parties for businessmen. Nothing more than that. Just your time and your company. Dressed nicely, smiling, making conversation." Joy had looked at the floor. Mirabel had been quiet. Sandra had been the one to ask the question all 3 of them were thinking. "What kind of place is this, exactly?" Temi had answered carefully. "The kind of place that pays. The kind of place that doesn't ask questions. And the kind of place where nobody from your church will ever see you." Sandra said no. At first. She said no firmly, and she said it for all 3 of them, and Temi nodded respectfully and left. For 2 weeks, they did not speak about it. But then Sandra's mother was admitted to the hospital again, and the doctor called Sandra's phone and said the words that changed everything. "Miss Sandra, if we do not begin dialysis by next week, we cannot guarantee what will happen." Sandra sat on the floor of her apartment after that phone call. She sat on the floor for a very long time, and she called Temi. The first night was terrifying. Sandra, Mirabel, and Joy had told themselves they would go once. Just once. to solve the immediate problem and then stop. They dressed carefully, not in the clothes they wore to church, not in anything that would make them recognizable. They took a cab to a part of the city far from Oakery Street, far from Victory Gospel Church, far from everything and everyone they knew. The party was inside a large, clean house behind a gate. There were men in suits. There were waiters carrying trays. There was music playing softly, nothing like the worship music they knew, but calm and low. Temmie was there to introduce them and stay close. Their job was simple. Walk around, smile, carry trays of drinks, make conversation when a guest spoke to them. Nothing more. Sandra kept her eyes near the door all evening, ready to leave at any moment. Mirabel counted the minutes on her watch. Joy smiled her quiet smile and said nothing to anyone unless she was spoken to first. At the end of the night, an envelope was handed to each of them. Sandra opened hers in the cab on the way home. Her hands were shaking. Inside was more money than she made in 2 months of teaching. Nobody said anything for the whole ride back. When they reached Sandra's apartment, Joy was the first to speak. "Once," she said. "That's all." "We agreed." Sandra nodded. "Once," she said. But they both knew, even as they said it, that the situation that had brought them here had not changed. And once never stays once when the need doesn't go away. The next Sunday, Sandra stood at the front of the choir. White dress, Bible in her hand, voice raised in worship. And she felt like she was two different people inside one body. One person who loved God, who genuinely, truly, deeply believed every word she sang. And another person who had stood in a house full of strangers 3 nights ago, smiling for money. She sang louder that morning than she ever had before. People in the congregation wiped tears from their eyes and said, "The Spirit is moving today." Mirabel played the keyboard with her eyes closed. Joy harmonized from the back row, her voice clear and high and achingly beautiful. Sister Grace, sitting in the front pew beside her husband, looked up at the 3 girls with a warm smile and leaned over to whisper to the pastor, "Those girls are truly anointed. We are so blessed to have them." Pastor Emmanuel nodded without looking up from his Bible.
"Yes," he said.
"God is faithful." The weeks that followed were a careful balancing act that took everything the 3 girls had. They went back to the parties, not every weekend, but enough. Temmie always made sure they were placed together, always made sure the environment was controlled, always made sure they left before anything changed in the room. Sandra used her money to begin her mother's dialysis. The hospital stopped calling with warnings. Her mother's color began to come back slowly, and one afternoon she sat up in the hospital bed and said, "Sandra, you are working so hard for me. God will reward you." Sandra had held her mother's hand and smiled. She had not said a word. Mirabel quietly began saving enough to help her mother consider leaving her father, a plan she was building slowly, carefully, like someone defusing a bomb, because she knew that leaving a man like that without a plan was more dangerous than staying. Joy paid her rent. She found a small part-time job in a phone repair shop that kept her days busy. The nights she gave to this secret were few, but they were enough to keep her head above water while she searched for something better. They never talked about it openly, even with each other. It existed in the space between them like a shared breath, present, real, but never named out loud. They still prayed together every night. They still sent the voice notes. They still bowed their heads and meant every word. Because here is the thing that nobody standing outside their lives would ever understand. They had not stopped believing. They had not stopped trying. They had not stopped being who they were. They were just also trying to survive. It was the 4th time they had gone, and they had decided, quietly, among themselves, that this would be the last. Sandra's mother's dialysis was stable now. Mirabel had found a women's shelter that had agreed to help her mother when the time came. Joy had been offered a proper job starting the following Monday. It was going to be over. They had dressed, taken the cab, done the evening, and now they were outside on the street waiting for their ride home. They were laughing. Not a wild laugh. Not a reckless laugh. The relieved, exhausted, it's finally over laugh of 3 young women who had carried something impossibly heavy for months and could finally feel it beginning to lift. Joy made a joke. Sandra threw her head back. Mirabel covered her mouth with her hand and laughed so hard her eyes watered. And that exact moment of joy was the moment Sister Grace's car turned onto Shiloh Lane. That was the moment the photo was taken. That was the moment three girls standing under an orange light, laughing after the last night of the hardest season of their lives, became something else entirely in someone else's story. They did not see the car. They did not see the flash of the phone camera. They did not know that by the time they got home that night, a photo of the three of them was already being typed into a WhatsApp message with the words, "You will not believe what I just saw." The message landed first in the phone of Mama Chidinma, the head of the Women's Fellowship, the most senior woman in Victory Gospel Church, the woman who had personally laid hands on Sandra and prayed over her when her father died. She read it. She looked at the photo. She read the message again. And then she forwarded it. By the time Sandra woke up the next morning and reached for her phone, the message had traveled to 47 contacts inside Victory Gospel Church. By the time she saw the first missed call from her mother's hospital room phone, which meant her mother had somehow seen it too, the message had been forwarded again and was now in a group chat called VGC Family Urgent Prayer Request. Sandra stared at the photo on her screen. At herself. At Mirabel. At Joy. Laughing under the orange light on Shiloh Lane. And for the first time in all of this, through the hospital bills, the secret nights, the double life, the prayers whispered with trembling lips, Sandra felt something break inside her chest. Not because she was caught, but because of the caption Sister Grace had typed beneath the photo. 6 words. 6 words that had already been read by the entire church. Are these really our worship leaders? Sandra's phone rang again. It was the pastor. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at his name on the screen, watching it ring. Outside her window, the morning sun was coming up over the city, golden and ordinary and completely unaware of everything that was about to happen. She pressed answer, and the voice on the other end said, in a low, careful tone that was somehow more frightening than shouting, "Sandra, I think we need to talk. All 3 of you. Today. Before service." The call ended. Sandra put the phone down on her lap. And for the first time since this all began, she opened her mouth and cried. The pastor's office smelled like old wood and Bible pages. It was a small room at the back of the church building, the kind of room that had seen many private conversations over the years. Confessions. Reconciliations. Tears. Prayers whispered so low they barely made a sound. Sandra had been in this room before. The day her father's body was brought home, Pastor Emmanuel had called her in here, held her hands, and prayed over her while she shook. She had felt safe in this room that day. She had felt like the walls themselves were holding her. Today, those same walls felt like they were closing in. Sandra sat in the middle chair. Mirabel was on her left. Joy was on her right. None of them had spoken in the car on the way here. None of them had eaten. None of them had slept. Joy's eyes were red and swollen. She had been crying since the night before when Mirabel had called her at 2 in the morning and said, "It's out. Everyone knows." Mirabel sat very still, the way she always sat when she was trying to keep herself together. Hands folded in her lap, back straight, jaw set. But her right knee was bouncing slightly under the table, and Sandra could see it. The door opened. Pastor Emmanuel walked in. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and reading glasses that always sat a little too far down his nose. Behind him came Sister Grace, her face arranged in the careful expression of someone who believed they had done the right thing and was prepared to defend it. And behind Sister Grace came Mama Chidinma, the head of the Women's Fellowship, moving slowly with her walking stick, her eyes moving over the 3 girls like she was seeing them for the first time. The pastor sat down. He removed his glasses, cleaned them with the corner of his shirt, put them back on. Then he placed his phone on the table, screen up, with the photo facing them. Sandra did not look at it. She already knew what it showed. "I want to give you the chance to speak," Pastor Emmanuel said quietly. "Before anything else is said or decided, I want to hear from you. So, I am asking and I want the truth. What were you doing on that street?" The room was so quiet that Sandra could hear the ceiling fan turning slowly above them. She opened her mouth. And then Sister Grace leaned forward and said, before Sandra could form a single word, "Pastor, I saw them with my own eyes. I wasn't imagining it. That street, everybody knows what that street is. And they were standing right there, dressed like Grace." The pastor said it once, low and firm, without turning to look at his wife. Sister Grace sat back. The room was quiet again. "Sandra," the pastor said, "you were about to say something." Sandra looked at her hands in her lap. She had rehearsed this on the way here. She had thought about what to say, how to explain, how to give context, how to make someone understand something that she herself still wasn't sure how to name. But sitting in this room, under these eyes, with that photo face up on the table between them, every sentence she had prepared dissolved. So she did something she had not planned to do. She told the truth. All of it. She started with her mother. She talked about the phone call from the doctor. She talked about the dialysis bills. She talked about the day she had sat outside the pastor's office. Not once, not twice, but 3 times, waiting to ask for help, and each time being told, "We will pray," and nothing more. Her voice was steady at first. Careful. Like someone walking barefoot on gravel, placing each word down slowly. Then she talked about the night Temmie had come to them. She explained what the work actually was, the carrying of trays, the smiling, the conversation. She said it plainly, without drama, without trying to make it sound better than it was, but also without allowing it to be made worse than it was. "We were not doing what people are assuming we were doing," Sandra said. "I know what that street looks like. I know what people think when they hear the name of it. But we were at a private party inside a house on that road. We were serving drinks. That is the truth." She paused. "I am not proud of the secret. I am not happy that we hid it. But I am also not going to sit here and let something be made into something it wasn't." Then Mirabel spoke. Her voice was quieter than Sandra's, and she looked directly at Mama Chidinma when she talked. Not at the pastor, not at Sister Grace, but at the older woman who had once told her to pray and endure. She talked about her father. She talked about 15 years of watching her mother hurt. She talked about the night she had come to the women's fellowship looking for guidance and been told that marriage was a covenant and pain was something to be endured for God. "I needed money to help my mother leave safely," Mirabel said. "Not to run away, not to shame anyone, to survive, to get her out of a house that was hurting her. I thought if I could just save enough." Her voice cracked. She stopped, pressed her lips together, continued. "I didn't know where else to go. I had already tried here." Mama Chidinma's face moved for the first time. Something behind her eyes shifted, slow and heavy, like a door opening that hadn't been opened in a long time. Then Joy spoke. Joy, who had been the quietest of the 3, who had barely lifted her eyes since they sat down, who looked in that moment like a girl who had walked a very long way and was not sure she had the strength to walk any further. She talked about the village, about her father's last words to her, "Don't bring shame to this family," about the city that had been harder than she imagined, about losing her job, about her rent, about 3 weeks of silence from everyone she had asked for help. "I have no family here," Joy said softly. "This church was supposed to be my family. That's what you always say from the pulpit, the church is family. But when I needed the family, I didn't know how to ask, and I was afraid of being judged. So I found another way." She finally looked up. Her eyes moved to Sister Grace. "The night you saw us, we were laughing because it was the last time. We had decided it was over. Sandra's mother was stable. Mirabel had found help for her mother. I had a new job starting Monday. We were standing on that street laughing because it was finally finished." Joy's voice dropped to almost nothing. "That was the moment you took the photo." The room was completely silent. Sister Grace's carefully arranged expression had come apart. She was staring at Joy with something that was trying to be composure, but was quickly becoming something else entirely. Pastor Emmanuel had not moved. He sat with both hands flat on the table, looking at the 3 girls, and his face held the particular expression of a man who is in the middle of understanding something about himself that he does not find comfortable. It was Mama Chidinma who moved first. The old woman with the walking stick stood up slowly from her chair. Everyone watched her. She walked around the table, slowly, heavily, leaning on her stick, until she was standing in front of Mirabel. She reached out her free hand and placed it on top of Mirabel's folded hands. "I told you to endure," Mama Chidinma said. Her voice was old and rough and very quiet. "I told you to endure, and I did not ask what you were enduring. And that was wrong. That was my failure, not yours." Mirabel looked up at her, and the composure she had held all morning, the straight back and the still hands and the set jaw, finally broke. She bowed her head and began to cry. Not quietly, not the contained, dignified tears of someone trying to hold on. She cried the way a person cries when they have been holding something for too long and someone has finally said the words that made it safe to put it down. Mama Chidinma lowered herself carefully into the chair beside her and said nothing else. She just kept her hand on top of Mirabel's and let her cry. Pastor Emmanuel cleared his throat. He took off his glasses again. This time, he did not clean them. He just held them in his hand and looked at the table. When he spoke, his voice was different from the voice he used on Sundays. It was smaller, more careful, like a man choosing words from a shelf he did not often reach for. "I remember when you came to see me," he said to Sandra. "About your mother. I remember it." Sandra said nothing. "I said I would pray. And I did pray. But I did not act. And prayer without action is," he stopped. "Started again. I failed you. This church failed you. And I have to sit with that." He placed his glasses back on his face. "What I will not do, what I refuse to do, is stand in front of this congregation and present these 3 young women as examples of moral failure when the failure here belongs to far more people in this building than just them." Sister Grace made a small sound. Her husband turned to look at her for the first time since they had entered the room. "You took a photo," he said to her. "You sent it to Mama Chidinma. And before you had asked a single question, before you had spoken one word to any of these girls, it was in 47 phones." Sister Grace's chin lifted slightly. "I saw what I saw." "You saw 3 young women standing on a street at night. That is all you saw. Everything else was added by assumption." The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that changes rooms. Sister Grace looked at Sandra, then at Mirabel, still crying quietly beside Mama Chidinma, then at Joy, sitting small and still with her red eyes and her hands in her lap. And something in Sister Grace's face, the armored, righteous certainty that had carried her from that cold night on Shiloh Lane all the way into this office, slowly, visibly, began to give way. Her eyes glistened. She pressed her lips together. "I didn't know," she said. Her voice had lost its shape. "I genuinely didn't know." "No," the pastor said quietly. "You didn't. And that is exactly the point." 3 days later, it was Sunday. The church was full. Word had spread. Of course it had, because word always spreads in a church family, in both directions. The photo had circulated. The whispers had circulated. And now, something else was circulating too, moving through the congregation in fragments and half-sentences, and nobody was quite sure what was true yet. People filled their seats with an energy that was different from a normal Sunday morning. It was tighter, more watchful, the kind of attention that fills a room when people know something important is about to happen but don't know exactly what shape it will take. The worship team took their positions. Sandra, Mirabel, and Joy stood in the choir stand. Some faces in the congregation looked surprised to see them there. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked relieved. And some, the faces that had forwarded the photo, the voices that had spoken their names in the church WhatsApp groups with certainty and disgust, those faces looked uncertain for the first time. Sandra looked out at the congregation. She found her mother's face in the 3rd row. Her mother, thinner now than she used to be, moving carefully after months of illness, but there, present, alive, looking up at her daughter with eyes that held a question she hadn't yet asked aloud, and an answer she already somehow knew. Sandra held her mother's gaze for a moment. Then she turned to face the front, and she began to sing. The song she had chosen was one the church knew well, a simple song about grace. About mercy that doesn't ask questions before it gives. About arms that open before an explanation is finished. The first note came out of her clear and full and steady. And the congregation felt it. The way you feel the first drop of rain before a storm, a single thing that carries the weight of everything that is about to come. Mirabel joined from the keyboard. Joy's harmony lifted from behind. And then the choir came in, and then the congregation, and the room filled up with sound the way it always did on Sunday mornings at Victory Gospel Church. But this Sunday was different. Because this Sunday, Pastor Emmanuel walked to the pulpit after worship, and instead of opening his Bible, he stood there for a long moment with his hands at his sides, looking out at his congregation. And he said, "Before I preach today, I need to do something I should have done a long time ago. I need to confess." The church went very still. 3 weeks ago, the pastor said, "A young woman came and sat outside my office. She came to ask for help. She told me her mother was sick. She told me she was struggling, and I told her I would pray."
He paused.
I prayed, but I did not pick up the phone. I did not organize a collection. I did not call her back. I assumed that prayer alone was enough, and in doing so, I left one of our own to carry a weight that this church was supposed to help her carry. The silence in the room was the kind that holds its breath. This week, a photo of 3 young women in this church was shared widely among us. It was shared with judgment and assumption before a single question was asked. And I want to stand here today and say, clearly, with no ambiguity, that we got it wrong. He turned slightly to look toward the choir stand.
Sandra.
Mirabel.
Joy.
I am asking for your forgiveness.
Publicly.
In front of this family. Because this church failed you privately, and it shamed you publicly, and you deserved neither. Someone in the congregation made a sound, not quite a cry, and not quite a gasp. Something in between. Sandra stood very straight in the choir stand. She did not cry. She had done her crying. Now she just stood and listened, and let the words land. "I want to say something to everyone in this room," the pastor continued, his voice gaining weight now, building the way it did when he was finding the center of something. "We talk about grace every week. We sing about it. We pray for it. We thank God for giving it to us. But grace that we receive and do not give, that is not grace. That is just comfort for ourselves." He looked out at the congregation. Before you share a photo, ask a question. Before you form an opinion, knock on a door. Before you say you know someone's story, sit down and listen to it. Because the truth of a person's life is almost always more complicated, more painful, and more brave than the single moment you happen to see. He opened his Bible then, not to preach a long sermon, just to read one verse. John 8 verse 7. "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone." He closed the Bible. That's enough for today. The weeks that followed were not perfect. Healing rarely is. Some people in the church apologized quietly, a hand on a shoulder, a text message sent late at night, a small envelope pressed into Sandra's hand after service with more money than Sandra had ever expected and no name written on it. Some people said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. A few people left the church entirely, not because of Sandra, Mirabel, and Joy, but because a pastor who confesses from the pulpit made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite explain but didn't want to examine. Sister Grace came to Sandra's apartment one evening. She came alone, without her husband, without any role or title. She came as a woman who had done something she regretted and wanted to say so to the person she had hurt. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she said, "I can't undo the photo. I wish I could. I am sorry, Sandra. I am truly sorry." Sandra looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." Mirabel's mother left her father on a Tuesday morning in November while he was at work. Mirabel had organized everything, the shelter, the transport, the documents. She had done it carefully, the way she did everything, making sure each step was in place before the next one was taken. Her mother arrived at the shelter with one bag and shaking hands. Mirabel was waiting at the door. They held each other for a long time. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. Joy started her new job on the Monday after that last Sunday. It was a proper job at a communications firm that had seen her CV and liked what they found. She wore a new blouse she had bought with the last of the money from those nights and told herself that this was the last thing those nights would give her, and she meant it with her whole heart. Her first week passed, then a month, then 2. She saved carefully. She ate simply. She sent money home to her parents in the village at the end of every month, always a little more than she had the month before. Her father called her one evening when the amount she sent was more than he expected. He was quiet for a moment on the phone. Then he said, "You're doing well." It was not an apology. It was not "I'm proud of you" or "I'm sorry for what I said when you left." But it was her father. And it was the closest thing to softness she had ever heard from him. "Yes," Joy said. "I am doing well." And she meant it. Sandra's mother finished her course of dialysis in February. The doctor called Sandra into his office, the same small room that smelled like bleach where he had first delivered the bad news. And this time he said, with a quiet, professional smile, "She's responding better than we anticipated. We are cautiously optimistic." Sandra nodded, thanked him, walked out of the office. She got to the car park before her legs stopped working properly. She sat on a low wall and put her face in her hands. And she stayed like that for a while, not crying exactly, but not crying either. Something between the two. The kind of release that the body performs when it has been holding something for so long it has forgotten what it feels like not to hold it, and then suddenly, without warning, the weight is lifted. She thought about everything. The dialysis bills, the parties, the orange lights, the photo, the office, the pastor's voice saying, "I failed you." Her mother's face in the 3rd row on that Sunday. She thought about all of it. And then she sat up straight, took a breath, and drove to the hospital to sit with her mother. It was a Sunday morning in March. Victory Gospel Church was full again, the way it always was, the way it had always been, with the flowers and the anointing oil, and the children running in the compound, and the old men under the mango tree. Sandra, Mirabel, and Joy stood in the choir stand. White dresses. Voices raised. But something was different now. Not in how they looked. In how they stood. There was something in the way Sandra's shoulders sat, not pulled high and tight with the weight of a secret, but level, easy, the posture of a person who has nothing to hide and has made peace with everything she has lived through. There was something in the way Mirabel's hands moved on the keyboard, not mechanical and controlled, but flowing, like water that has finally found the direction it was always meant to travel. There was something in the way Joy sang, fuller than before, if that was even possible. As if whatever she had been carrying in her voice before had been holding it back, and now that the weight was gone, the sound could finally be completely itself. The congregation felt it. They always feel these things, even when they cannot name them. And in the 3rd row, Sandra's mother, sitting upright now, color back in her face, a small smile on her lips, closed her eyes and swayed gently to the music. And Mama Chidinma, in her usual seat near the aisle, looked up at the 3 girls in the choir stand. She thought about what she had said to Mirabel all those months ago, pray and endure, and she thought about how those words, offered without curiosity, without care, without the simple desire to truly know what was being endured, had contributed to the making of a secret that should never have needed to be a secret. She had said it to herself many times since that day in the pastor's office. She would probably say it to herself many times more. That is how real learning works. Not one clean moment of understanding, just the same lesson, returning, becoming truer each time. She watched the 3 girls sing, and she thought, not for the first time, that the most dangerous thing a person can do is look at someone and believe they already know their story. Sandra, Mirabel, and Joy were never street girls. They were never what the whispers said they were. They were 3 young women surviving in a world that did not always make survival easy, in a community that preached grace from the pulpit, but sometimes forgot to practice it in the car park. They were girls who loved God and struggled anyway, because faith does not make the rent disappear. Faith does not stop a mother's kidneys from failing. Faith does not heal the bruises that happen behind closed doors in houses where a man says, "Praise the Lord" on Sunday morning. They were girls who made choices that looked one way from the outside and looked completely different from the inside, because most choices do when you actually take the time to walk around them. They were not perfect. But then again, neither was the church. Neither was the pastor. Neither was Sister Grace, sitting in the third pew that Sunday morning with tears running quietly down her face as the choir sang, not from emotion about the music, but from something older and heavier, the particular weight of a person learning, too late and then just in time, that judgment is the easiest thing in the world to give and the hardest thing in the world to take back. Neither was Mama Chidinma, with her walking stick and her old hands and her long life full of wisdom that had somehow not yet taught her to ask a question before she gave an answer. Neither were any of us. That is the truth this story has been building toward from the very first word. Not that church girls are secretly street girls. Not that good people are hiding bad things. But that people are carrying more than you can see. And the single moment you happen to witness, the orange light, the late hour, the unexpected street, is never, ever the whole story. Ask before you assume. Listen before you judge. And before you pick up that stone, check your hands. Because none of us, not one of us, has hands clean enough to throw it. This story is dedicated to every person who has ever been judged for a moment that did not contain their whole truth. You are more than what someone saw. You are more than what they said. Your story is not finished. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to this channel to support our growth. Every subscriber helps us bring more stories like this one to more people who need to hear them. Share this with someone who needs it today. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.